The wedding dress hung on Caroline Zimmerman like a burial shroud, 2 sizes too large for her diminishing frame, as she stood before Reverend Patterson in the small wooden church of Bonanza, Nevada, wondering if she would make it through the ceremony before collapsing. She had not eaten a proper meal in 3 days, surviving only on creek water and the memory of better times, but her father's debts demanded payment, and the man standing beside her, a silver mine foreman twice her age with breath that reeked of whiskey, represented her family's only salvation from complete ruin. The year was 1874, and Caroline had just turned 19 that spring, though the mirror now reflected someone much older, someone hollowed out by circumstance and desperation. Her father had lost everything in a bad mining investment, and when he died of pneumonia that brutal winter, he left behind nothing but outstanding loans to dangerous men. Marcus Thornhill, the 45-year-old foreman, had offered to clear those debts in exchange for a wife, and Caroline's mother had accepted on her daughter's behalf before fleeing to California with her sister, leaving Caroline alone with a choice that was no choice at all. The church was sparse, holding maybe a dozen people who came more out of morbid curiosity than genuine well-wishing. The walls needed paint, and the cross above the altar hung slightly crooked, much like everything else in Caroline's life. She could feel Marcus's hand gripping her elbow, his fingers digging into her skin through the thin fabric, anchoring her in place as if he feared she might bolt at any moment. He was not entirely wrong to worry. Reverend Patterson cleared his throat and began the ceremony, his voice droning on about sacred unions and holy matrimony. Caroline's vision began to blur at the edges, tiny spots of darkness dancing across her field of sight. The hunger had been manageable that morning, just a dull ache in her belly, but as the ceremony progressed, that ache transformed into waves of dizziness that threatened to pull her under. She locked her knees, trying to remain upright, focusing on a water stain on the wall behind the reverend's head. "If anyone here has objections to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace," Reverend Patterson intoned, and Caroline felt a wild, inappropriate urge to laugh. Who would object? Who in this town cared enough about her fate to intervene? The church door slammed open with such force that the sound echoed off the bare walls like a gunshot. Every head turned toward the entrance, where a man stood silhouetted against the bright Nevada sunlight. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and covered in trail dust, with a cowboy hat pulled low over his face. For a moment, nobody moved or spoke. "I apologize for the interruption, Reverend," the man said, his voice carrying a drawl that spoke of Texas origins. "But I am looking for a Miss Caroline Zimmerman. I have urgent business regarding her father's estate." Marcus's grip on Caroline's elbow tightened painfully. "This is a private ceremony. Whatever business you have can wait." The cowboy stepped further into the church, and Caroline could now see his face, bronzed by sun and weather, with eyes the color of creek water in summer. He could not have been much older than 25, with the lean, hard build of someone who lived in the saddle. "I am afraid it cannot wait, sir. I am Dalton York, attorney for Zimmerman mining interests in San Francisco. I have been trying to locate Miss Zimmerman for the better part of 2 weeks." "Attorney," Marcus said, his voice dripping with suspicion, "you look more like a cattle driver." "I find it useful to be able to handle myself on the road, given the nature of travel these days," Dalton replied calmly. "Miss Zimmerman, I need to speak with you immediately regarding your inheritance." "There is no inheritance," Caroline heard herself say, though her voice sounded very far away. "My father died penniless." "That is not entirely accurate," Dalton said, removing his hat and holding it against his chest. Your father had a silent partnership in a mining operation near Virginia City. That operation has just yielded a significant strike. You are now a woman of considerable means." The church erupted in murmurs, and Caroline felt the room begin to spin in earnest. Marcus's hand dropped from her elbow as he turned to face her, his expression transforming from possessive assurance to calculating greed in the space of a heartbeat. The Reverend was saying something, and Dalton was walking toward her, but all of it was happening through a thick fog that grew denser with each passing second. "I do not believe him," Marcus said loudly. "This is some kind of trick. Continue the ceremony, Reverend." But Caroline was no longer listening. The spots in her vision had merged into a solid wall of darkness, and the last thing she registered was the hard wooden floor rushing up to meet her as her legs finally gave out beneath her. She was not unconscious long, maybe 30 seconds at most, but when awareness returned, she found herself cradled in strong arms, being carried out of the church into the brilliant afternoon sunshine. The arms belonged to Dalton York, and he was speaking to her in a low, urgent voice. "When did you last eat, Miss Zimmerman?" Caroline tried to form words, but her mouth felt stuffed with cotton. "Tuesday. I think it was Tuesday." "Today is Friday," Dalton said, and she could hear the anger threading through his carefully controlled tone, though she sensed it was not directed at her. 3 days. You have not eaten in 3 days, and they were marrying you off to that vulture." He carried her across the dusty main street toward what appeared to be the town's only hotel, a 2-story structure that had seen better days. People stopped to stare, and Caroline could hear Marcus shouting something behind them, but Dalton did not slow or acknowledge the commotion. He kicked open the hotel door and addressed the startled clerk behind the desk. "I need your best room, a bathtub filled with hot water, and every bit of food your kitchen can prepare in the next 10 minutes. Send it all upstairs." "Sir, I do not think," the clerk began. Dalton set Caroline carefully on her feet, keeping one arm around her waist to steady her, and produced a gold coin that he slapped on the desk with his free hand. "I am not asking you to think. I am asking you to move quickly." The clerk snatched up the coin and grabbed a key from the board behind him. "Room 7, top of the stairs, best in the house." Dalton guided Caroline up the narrow staircase, his hand never leaving her waist. She was acutely aware of how improper this all was, being escorted to a hotel room by a strange man, but her body was too weak and her mind too clouded to muster much protest. The room, when they entered, was small but clean, with a brass bed frame and a window overlooking the street. He settled her into the room's only chair, a wooden rocker near the window, and knelt before her so they were at eye level. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the result of years squinting into the sun, and a small scar that cut through his left eyebrow. His eyes, which she had thought were merely blue-green from a distance, held flecks of gold near the pupils. "I need you to stay awake for me," he said. "I know you are exhausted, but you need to eat something before you sleep. Can you do that?" Caroline nodded, not trusting her voice. The concern in his expression seemed genuine, which made no sense. He did not know her, had no reason to care whether she lived or died, yet he was looking at her as if her well-being mattered deeply to him. A knock at the door announced the arrival of their food, and Dalton rose to answer it. A young woman entered carrying a tray laden with bread, cheese, cold chicken, apples, and a pot of coffee. The smells hit Caroline like a physical force, and her stomach cramped with sudden, desperate hunger. Dalton took the tray and set it on the small table beside her, then pulled up the room's other chair, a straight-backed wooden one, and sat facing her. "Start slow," he instructed, tearing off a piece of bread and handing it to her. Your stomach will rebel if you eat too fast. Caroline took the bread with trembling hands and bit into it. The taste was overwhelming, so simple yet so perfect that tears sprang to her eyes. She chewed slowly, as instructed, and swallowed, then took another bite. Dalton watched her eat with the same intense focus she imagined he would bring to breaking a difficult horse or tracking game, and there was something oddly comforting about that attention. "Why?" she asked after finishing the bread and starting on the cheese. "Why does a lawyer from San Francisco dress like a cowboy and ride all the way to Bonanza to find me?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I am a lawyer, that part is true. I handle mining claims and estates for several firms in the city. But I grew up on a cattle ranch outside of Austin, and I did my share of trail drives before I went east for schooling. The clothes are comfortable, and like I said, being able to handle trouble on the road is useful." "You could have sent a telegram," Caroline pointed out, reaching for the chicken. "I did. 3 of them. They all came back undelivered, so I made some inquiries and learned that you were about to marry Marcus Thornhill to settle your father's debts. Given what I know about Thornhill's reputation, I decided speed was more important than propriety." "What do you know about him?" Dalton's expression darkened. "He has been married twice before. The first wife died under questionable circumstances, fell down the stairs according to the inquest, though the doctor noted bruising inconsistent with that story. The second wife disappeared entirely, ran off according to Thornhill, though nobody ever heard from her again. He likes control, likes breaking things, and from what I saw today, he was about to add you to his collection." Caroline set down the chicken, her appetite momentarily forgotten. "I did not know. About the wives, I mean. I knew he was not a good man, but I thought—" She trailed off, not wanting to finish the sentence. What had she thought? That she could endure anything if it meant honoring her father's debts, that her suffering was the price of her father's mistakes. "You are 19 years old," Dalton said quietly. "Whatever mistakes your father made, you do not owe him your life. I am his daughter. His debts are paid. The mining strike your father invested in before he died has yielded more than enough silver to clear every debt he owed and leave you with a substantial sum besides. You are free, Miss Zimmerman, completely free." The words did not make sense at first. Freedom was not a concept Caroline had associated with herself for so long that she struggled to understand what it might mean. Free from debt, free from Marcus, free to make her own choices. The idea was so foreign and so overwhelming that fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, and once they started, she could not stop them. Dalton did not try to comfort her with empty platitudes or unwanted touch. He simply sat with her while she cried, occasionally refilling her coffee cup or pushing the food tray closer when she showed signs of composing herself. By the time the tears subsided, Caroline had eaten most of what was on the tray, and exhaustion was pulling at her like a riptide. "I should let you rest," Dalton said, standing and moving toward the door. "I have taken a room down the hall. If you need anything, I am in room 3. There is a lock on your door, use it. And Miss Zimmerman, we will need to discuss your inheritance in detail tomorrow, but for tonight, just sleep. You are safe." After he left, Caroline locked the door as instructed and collapsed onto the bed without even removing her wedding dress. She was asleep within seconds, plunging into a deep, dreamless oblivion that her body desperately needed. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of birds chattering on the roof above. For a disoriented moment, she did not know where she was, but then memory returned in a rush. The wedding, the fainting Dalton York appearing like something out of a story. She sat up slowly, relieved to find that her head was clear and the bone-deep exhaustion had lifted somewhat, Someone had left a tray outside her door. She discovered when she unlocked it and peered into the hallway. This one held fresh bread, butter, jam, and a pot of tea that was still warm. A note in masculine handwriting read, "Eat this. I will call on you at 10 o'clock if that is acceptable. Die." Caroline brought the tray inside and ate while looking out the window at Bonanza's Main Street. The town was built into the side of a mountain, as most mining towns were, with buildings that seemed to defy gravity as they clung to the steep slopes. She could see the mine entrance from her window, a dark mouth in the mountainside where men disappeared each morning and emerged each evening covered in dust and sweat, hoping their labor would yield silver or gold or copper, anything to justify the risk. Her father had been one of those men once, before he scraped together enough money to become an investor instead of a laborer. She tried to reconcile Dalton's news with what she had believed about her father's financial situation. He had never mentioned a partnership in Virginia City, but then he had kept many things from her and her mother, too proud to admit when his schemes were failing. A knock at precisely 10 o'clock announced Dalton's arrival. He had cleaned up from yesterday's travel, though he still wore the practical clothes of a working man rather than a lawyer's suit. His dark hair was damp, indicating a recent bath, and he carried a leather satchel that presumably held documents related to her inheritance. "Good morning, Miss Zimmerman. May I come in?" "I am not sure it is proper," Caroline said, though she stepped aside to let him enter anyway. "People will talk. People are already talking. You fainted at your own wedding and a stranger carried you out of the church. The damage to your reputation, such as it is, has already been done." He set his satchel on the table and pulled out several folders. "Besides, we have business to discuss, and I would rather do it privately than in the hotel lobby where everyone can listen." He was right, of course. Caroline closed the door but left it slightly ajar, a minor concession to propriety that would fool no one but made her feel slightly better about the situation. Dalton spread papers across the table, and for the next hour he walked her through her father's estate. The partnership in Virginia City had been formed 5 years ago, when her father sold his claim in Bonanza to invest in what seemed like a more promising operation. That operation had produced little for years, barely covering its costs, until 3 months ago when they hit a rich vein of silver. Her father had died not knowing his investment had finally paid off. The total value after settling all debts and legal fees comes to approximately $42,000, Dalton said, watching her face for a reaction. Caroline could not speak. $42,000 was more money than she could properly imagine. It was enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life if she was careful. It was enough to go anywhere, do anything, be anyone. "I do not understand," she finally managed. "Why did no one tell me? Why was I being married off to Marcus when this money existed? The silver strike happened after your father's death. The letters informing him of his good fortune arrived after he was already buried. My firm was engaged to locate his heirs, which proved more difficult than expected since your mother had left town and you had no fixed address. By the time I traced you here, you were days away from a marriage that would have given Thornhill legal control over your inheritance." "He knew," Caroline said, the realization hitting her like cold water. "Marcus knew about the money. That is why he was suddenly so interested in marrying me when he had barely looked at me before." "I suspect someone at the mining company has loose lips," Dalton agreed. "Word of a strike travels fast in these towns. Thornhill probably heard about it and moved quickly to secure his claim to you before you learned the truth." Caroline thought of Marcus's hands on her arm during the ceremony, the possessive grip that said she was property he was acquiring. Rage, bright and clean, burned through her. "What do I do now?" "Whatever you want," Dalton said simply. "The money is yours, legally and completely. You could stay in Bonanza, though I would not recommend it given Thornhill's presence. You could go to San Francisco or any other city. You could buy property, start a business, invest in more mining operations, anything you choose. What would you recommend? Honestly, leave Nevada. Go somewhere Thornhill cannot find you easily, somewhere you can start fresh without the shadow of your father's reputation following you. San Francisco has opportunities for an independent woman with capital. So do Denver and Salt Lake City. Even smaller towns in California or Oregon might suit you." Caroline moved to the window, looking out at the mountains that surrounded Bonanza. She had lived her entire life in mining towns, moving from claim to claim as her father chased his fortune. The idea of choosing her own destination, of going somewhere because she wanted to rather than because circumstances forced her, was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. "What if I make the wrong choice?" she asked quietly. Dalton came to stand beside her at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him but not so close as to be improper. "Then you make a different choice after that. You are not trapped anymore, Miss Zimmerman. Wrong choices are just part of learning how to be free." Something in his voice made her turn to look at him, and she found him gazing at her with an expression that was hard to decipher. Not pity exactly, but something softer and more complicated. "You did not have to come all this way yourself," she said. "You could have sent another lawyer, someone local, to handle the paperwork." "I could have," he admitted, "but I wanted to make sure you were all right. When I learned about the impending marriage to Thornhill and what kind of man he was, I felt responsible somehow. Your father entrusted his affairs to my firm, and by extension, I felt obligated to ensure his daughter was not harmed by his business dealings." "You felt obligated," Caroline repeated, trying to parse whether she was disappointed by that word. "Initially, yes. But now, having met you, I find I am invested in your well-being for entirely personal reasons that have nothing to do with professional obligation." He said it plainly, as if stating a simple fact rather than making a confession that could be construed as highly improper. Caroline's heart began beating faster. "Mr. York, Dalton, please. I think we have moved past strict formality given that I carried you unconscious out of your own wedding. Dalton, then, I do not know what to say to that. You do not have to say anything. I am simply being honest about my motivations. You have had enough people lie to you or manipulate you lately. I thought you might appreciate straightforwardness." Before Caroline could respond, heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway, and Marcus Thornhill's voice boomed through the partially open door. "I know you are in there, Caroline. We need to talk about yesterday's interruption." Dalton moved faster than Caroline would have thought possible, stepping between her and the door as Marcus pushed it fully open. The mine foreman looked worse than he had at the wedding, his face flushed and his eyes bloodshot, suggesting he had spent the intervening time drinking heavily. "The lady does not wish to speak with you," Dalton said calmly, though Caroline noticed his hand had moved to rest on the gun belt he wore. "The lady is my fiancée, and I will speak with her if I please," Marcus growled, trying to push past Dalton into the room. Dalton did not budge. "Actually, there was no wedding. Miss Zimmerman fainted, which invalidated the ceremony. She is under no obligation to you whatsoever. She owes me. Her father owed me money, and she is going to pay it back one way or another." "Her father owed you nothing," Dalton corrected. "I have reviewed all outstanding debts associated with the Zimmerman estate. Your name does not appear anywhere in the records, whatever arrangement you thought you had died with him." Marcus's face turned an alarming shade of purple. You think you can come into this town and steal what is mine? I will see you dead first, boy. I am not a boy, and Miss Zimmerman was never yours. Now, I am going to ask you once politely to leave. If I have to ask again, it will not be polite." For a moment, Caroline thought Marcus would throw a punch, and she held her breath, terrified of violence erupting in the small hotel room. But whatever Marcus saw in Dalton's expression made him reconsider. He spat on the floor, a gesture of contempt, and stabbed a finger toward Caroline. "This is not over. You think you are too good for me now because of some supposed inheritance. We will see how long that lasts. Money has a way of disappearing in these towns, especially money belonging to foolish young women who do not know how to protect it." "Was that a threat?" Dalton asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Marcus smiled unpleasantly. "Just friendly advice. Things happen in mining towns. Accidents, robberies, fires. Would be a shame if Miss Zimmerman came to harm before she could enjoy her good fortune." "Get out," Dalton said, and there was something in those two words that finally convinced Marcus to leave, though he made sure to slam the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Caroline realized she was shaking. Dalton turned to face her, his expression apologetic. "I am sorry you had to witness that. The man is a bully and a coward, but that does not make him less dangerous. He threatened me. He threatened both of us." "Yes, he did. Which is why I am going to suggest we leave Bonanza as soon as possible. Today, if you are strong enough to travel. Today." Caroline's mind reeled. "But my things, what few possessions I have, can be replaced. Miss Zimmerman, Caroline, please listen to me. Thornhill has spent years in this town building connections and establishing control. The sheriff is in his pocket, as are most of the mine supervisors. If he decides to make good on his threats, there is little recourse for justice here. The safest thing you can do is put distance between yourself and him as quickly as possible." Caroline knew he was right, but the thought of fleeing like a criminal when she had done nothing wrong galled her. "Where would we go? I have business back in San Francisco. You could travel with me at least that far and decide your next move from there. The city is large enough that Thornhill would have difficulty tracking you down, and there are better legal protections should he try anything." "Travel with you," Caroline repeated. "Alone, unchaperoned, for several days of travel." Dalton had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I know how it sounds, but I give you my word as a gentleman that I will treat you with nothing but respect. We can tell people you are my sister if it helps. Or my cousin, whatever story makes you most comfortable. And if I say no, if I decide to stay in Bonanza and face Marcus, then I will respect your decision and do everything in my power to help you, including hiring personal protection if necessary. But Caroline, please, understand what you would be choosing. This town will not protect you. The people here fear Thornhill and depend on the mine for their livelihoods. No one will stand with you against him." Caroline moved to the bed and sat down, trying to think through her options with a clear head. She could stay and fight, but Dalton was right that she would be fighting alone. She could flee by herself, but traveling alone as a young woman was dangerous even without the threat of Marcus pursuing her. Or she could trust this man who had appeared in her life less than 24 hours ago, who had already shown her more kindness than she had received in months. "If I agree to leave with you," she said slowly, "I need you to understand something. I am grateful for your help, truly I am, but I am not some helpless damsel who needs rescuing. I am a woman who was starved and cornered into a terrible situation. That does not make me weak or fragile. I can handle the truth, I can handle hardship, and I can handle making my own decisions. Do you understand?" Dalton smiled, and it transformed his face from merely handsome to genuinely beautiful. "I never thought you were weak, Caroline." A weak woman would have married Thornhill and endured whatever came after. You held on until there was another option. That took strength most people do not have. Then we leave today. But I have conditions. I pay my own way. Whatever the travel costs, it comes from my inheritance. I will not be dependent on your charity or feel obligated to you financially. And when we reach San Francisco, if I decide to go elsewhere, you will not try to stop me or convince me otherwise. Agreed. Though I reserve the right to offer advice, even if you choose not to take it. Fair enough. They spent the next 2 hours preparing for departure. Dalton arranged for horses and supplies while Caroline purchased a few necessities from the town's general store, including proper traveling clothes to replace the wedding dress she was still wearing. The clerk, Mrs. Henderson, kept giving her curious looks but was too polite or too afraid to ask direct questions. "I heard you called off the wedding," Mrs. Henderson ventured as she wrapped Caroline's purchases in brown paper. That took courage. Marcus is not a man who takes rejection well. "I did not call it off so much as circumstances intervened," Caroline said carefully. "Well, whatever happened, I am glad. My sister worked for his first wife back before the accident. She told me things, terrible things about how he treated that poor woman. None of us wanted to see you married to him, but nobody felt they could speak up against him." Caroline wanted to be angry at the town's complicity, but she could not quite muster it. She understood fear, understood the calculations people made to survive in places like Bonanza, where one man's displeasure could cost you your livelihood. "Thank you for telling me," she said instead. "I appreciate your honesty." By early afternoon, they were ready to leave. Dalton had secured 2 sturdy horses and a pack mule to carry supplies for the journey. Caroline had never been much of a rider, her experience limited to the occasional wagon trip between towns, but Dalton assured her the mare he had chosen was gentle and sure-footed. They left Bonanza quietly, without fanfare or goodbyes, and Caroline felt nothing but relief as the town disappeared behind them. The road to San Francisco would take them west through Nevada and into California, a journey of several weeks depending on weather and road conditions. They would stop in towns along the way when possible, camping in the open when necessary. The first day of travel passed in relative silence as Caroline focused on staying in the saddle and Dalton focused on putting distance between them and any potential pursuit. They stopped at sunset near a creek, where Dalton set up camp with practiced efficiency while Caroline tried to help and mostly got in the way. "I am not very good at this," she admitted, watching him start a fire with flint and steel. "You will learn. Everyone starts somewhere." He cooked a simple dinner of beans and salt pork, and they ate sitting on rocks near the fire. The Nevada night was cold despite the summer season, and Caroline found herself grateful for the warmth of the flames. Above them, stars appeared in vast numbers, more than she ever saw in town where mine lights and lanterns created a permanent haze. "Tell me about San Francisco," she said, breaking the comfortable quiet. "What is it like?" Dalton leaned back on his elbows, gazing up at the stars. "Crowded, noisy, exciting, overwhelming. It is a city that grew too fast, full of people from everywhere trying to make their fortunes or start over. The buildings are packed tight together, and the hills are steep enough to make your legs ache. But there is an energy to it, a sense that anything is possible if you are brave enough to reach for it. You like it there. Sometimes. The work is interesting, and I have made good friends, but I miss open spaces, miss being able to ride for hours without seeing another soul. The city feels like a cage some days, beautiful but still confining." "Why do you stay, then?" He was quiet for a moment, considering. "Duty, mostly. My father spent everything he had sending me east to school, training me to be something more than a ranch hand. Felt like I owed it to him to use that education, to be successful in ways he could not be. But lately, I have been questioning whether success is worth it if you are miserable. Caroline understood that sentiment deeply. My father was the same way, always chasing the next big strike, the next opportunity. He died still believing his fortune was just around the corner. I wonder sometimes if he was happy, even when things were going well, or if the chasing was all he knew how to do. Sounds like he gave you a gift then, even if he did not mean to, Dalton said, rolling his head to look at her. You get to decide what kind of life you want without his expectations weighing you down. Is that what you would do, if you were me? If I were you, I would take some time to figure out who Caroline Zimmerman is when she is not hungry or scared or trapped. Travel a bit, see different places, try different things. You are 19 years old with enough money to be comfortable. Most people never get that kind of freedom. It would be a shame to waste it rushing into the next obligation. They talked late into the night, swapping stories about their childhoods and their families. Dalton described growing up on his father's ranch, learning to rope cattle and break horses before he was 10 years old. Caroline talked about following her father from mining town to mining town, learning to adapt to new places and new schools, never staying long enough to form lasting friendships. When exhaustion finally forced them to sleep, Dalton had set up 2 bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, far enough apart to be proper but close enough that she felt safe knowing he was nearby. She fell asleep listening to the creek and the soft sounds of the horses moving through the darkness. The next several days fell into a pleasant routine. They rode during the cooler morning and evening hours, resting during the heat of midday. Dalton taught her how to properly care for her horse, how to read the land for water and good camping spots, and how to start a fire when wood was scarce. Caroline, in turn, discovered she enjoyed the freedom of the trail, the simplicity of life reduced to basic needs, and the steady progress of travel. They reached the small town of Silver Creek 5 days into their journey, and Dalton insisted they rest for a night in a proper hotel, rather than camping rough. Caroline appreciated the chance to bathe and sleep in a real bed, even as she found herself missing the intimacy of their campfire conversations. That evening, they ate dinner in the hotel restaurant, and Caroline noticed the way other diners looked at them, trying to figure out their relationship. Were they married, siblings, something improper? She realized she did not care much what strangers thought, a liberating discovery. You look pleased with yourself, Dalton observed, cutting into his steak. I was just thinking that a month ago, I would have been mortified by people speculating about us. Now I find I cannot muster the energy to worry about it. Good. Reputation is overrated anyway, especially for people trying to start fresh. Is that what I am doing, starting fresh? Are you not? Caroline considered the question seriously. I suppose I am. It still does not feel quite real yet. Like I am going to wake up and find myself back in Bonanza, still hungry, still trapped. Dalton reached across the table and laid his hand over hers, a gesture that should have felt too familiar but instead felt comforting. You are not trapped anymore. I promise you that. His touch sent warmth through her, a pleasant sensation that had nothing to do with the coffee she was drinking. She was becoming increasingly aware of Dalton not just as her rescuer or her traveling companion, but as a man, attractive and kind and interesting in ways she had not let herself fully acknowledge. It was complicated by gratitude and circumstance, but the feeling was there nonetheless, growing stronger with each passing day. They left Silver Creek the next morning and continued west. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled, the stark Nevada desert giving way to the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. The air grew slightly cooler, and trees became more common, offering shade during their midday rests. On the 8th day of travel, they stopped for lunch near a stand of cottonwood trees. Caroline was helping Dalton set out their meal when she heard riders approaching. 3 men emerged from the trees, rough-looking characters with guns on their hips and predatory expressions. "Well now, what do we have here?" the lead rider said, his gaze moving between Caroline and Dalton with obvious calculation. "Looks like a young couple out for a pleasant ride." Dalton stood slowly, his hand moving casually toward his own gun. "Just passing through, friend. No trouble here." Did not say there was trouble, just making friendly conversation. The man's smile revealed missing teeth. "Though now that you mention it, my friends and I have been down on our luck lately. Thought maybe you could spare some supplies, help us out." "I am afraid we only have enough for our own journey," Dalton said evenly. "But there is a town half a day's ride west where you can stock up on supplies. Half a day is a long time when you are hungry." The man's eyes settled on Caroline. Maybe the lady has something she would like to share. Caroline felt fear spike through her, but she forced herself to stand still and quiet, trusting Dalton to handle the situation. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he had shifted his weight onto the balls of his feet, ready to move quickly if needed. "The lady has nothing for you," Dalton said, and his voice had gone cold and hard. "I am going to suggest you 3 move along before this becomes unpleasant for everyone involved." The lead rider's smile faded. "That sounds like a threat, friend." "It is a statement of fact. You are 3 against 1, and you probably think those are good odds. But I promise you, at least one of you will not ride away from here if this turns into shooting. Maybe all 3 of you if I am lucky. The question is whether whatever you think you will gain from this is worth that risk." The 2 men behind the leader shifted nervously in their saddles, clearly less committed to the confrontation than their companion. A long, tense silence stretched out, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Caroline held her breath, praying they would back down. Finally, the lead rider spat into the dirt and yanked his horse's reins. "Not worth the trouble. Come on, boys." The 3 men rode off, and Caroline released the breath she had been holding. Dalton did not relax until they were completely out of sight, and even then he kept his hand near his gun. "We should move," he said. "I do not trust them not to circle back with reinforcements." They packed quickly and rode hard for the next several hours, not stopping until they reached a rocky outcrop that offered good visibility in all directions. Only then did Dalton seem satisfied that they were safe. "I am sorry," he said as they made camp. "I should have been more careful, should have seen them coming. You protected us. That is what matters. You were frightened. I saw it in your face." "Of course I was frightened. But I was not powerless, Dalton. I knew you would keep us safe, and you did." He looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "You have a lot of faith in me. You have given me reason to have faith in you." That night, as they sat by the fire, Dalton seemed troubled, staring into the flames with a furrowed brow. Caroline gave him space for a while, but eventually her curiosity got the better of her. "What is bothering you? Those men today. The situation could have gone very badly. And I realize that I have been putting you at risk by traveling alone with you like this. We should have arranged for an escort, or you should have waited in a town while I arranged safer transport." "Dalton, stop. You did not put me at risk. Staying in Bonanza would have been far more dangerous. And I chose to come with you, remember? Nobody forced me. I know, but nothing. I am not some porcelain doll that will shatter at the first sign of trouble. Bad things happen. People make threats. That does not mean I should spend my life hiding or only doing things that are perfectly safe." She paused, gathering her courage for what she wanted to say next. "And if I am being completely honest, I am glad it is just the 2 of us. I like talking to you. I like learning from you. I like spending time with you, even when it is hard or scary." Dalton looked up from the fire, meeting her eyes. "Caroline, you do not have to say anything. I just wanted you to know that I do not regret this journey, not for a moment." "I do not regret it either," he said softly, "though I probably should. I have been trying to tell myself that my interest in you is purely professional, that I am just doing my job by ensuring you reach San Francisco safely. But that is a lie. The truth is, I think about you constantly. Wonder what you are thinking, what makes you smile, what your dreams are for the future. And I have no right to those thoughts because you are my client and you have been through hell, and the last thing you need is me adding complications to your life." Caroline's heart was beating so fast she was sure he must be able to hear it. "What if I want complications? Then I would say you have not had enough time to know what you want. A week ago, you were starving and about to marry a man you did not love. Now you are suddenly wealthy and free for the first time in your life. Your whole world has changed completely. You should not make any big decisions about feelings or relationships until you have had time to adjust." He was right, logically and rationally, but Caroline found she did not care about logic in that moment. "And if my feelings do not change, if I still feel this way about you in a month or 2 months or 6 months, then we will talk about it. But Caroline, I need you to be sure. I will not take advantage of your gratitude or your circumstances. You deserve better than that." It was perhaps the most frustrating and most reassuring conversation Caroline had ever had. She wanted to argue, to tell him that she knew her own mind and heart, but a small part of her recognized the wisdom in what he was saying. So much had changed so quickly. Maybe she did need time to sort through her feelings and figure out what was real versus what was born from gratitude and proximity. "All right," she agreed reluctantly. "We will table this conversation for now. But Dalton, thank you for being honest with me. And for respecting me enough to want me to be certain." "Always," he promised. They continued their journey west, crossing into California after another week of travel. The landscape grew greener and more varied, with forests replacing desert and mountains giving way to rolling hills. They saw more travelers on the road as they drew closer to San Francisco. More towns and settlements, signs of civilization encroaching on the wilderness. Caroline found herself both excited and anxious as they drew closer to their destination. San Francisco represented possibility and opportunity, but it also meant the end of her time alone with Dalton. Once they reached the city, he would return to his law practice, and she would need to figure out what came next for her. The intimacy of the trail, the long conversations and shared meals, would be replaced by the ordinary reality of separate lives. They stopped in Sacramento for 2 days to rest and resupply before the final leg of their journey. The city was larger than anywhere Caroline had ever lived, bustling with commerce and activity. Dalton arranged for them to stay in a respectable boarding house, and for the first time since leaving Bonanza, they had real privacy and personal space. On their second evening in Sacramento, Dalton took her to a restaurant that overlooked the river. It was fancier than anywhere they had eaten on the trail, and Caroline was acutely aware of her worn traveling clothes and wind-burned face. But Dalton did not seem to notice or care, treating her with the same respect he would have shown a woman in silk and jewels. "I have been thinking about what comes next," he said over dessert. "When we reach San Francisco, you will need somewhere to stay while you sort out your plans. I have a colleague, a woman named Mrs. Patricia Flynn, who runs a boarding house specifically for young women new to the city. She is trustworthy and kind, and she can help you navigate society there." "You have it all planned out," Caroline said, trying not to feel disappointed that he had already thought about how to hand her off to someone else. I am just trying to think practically. Though I confess, my practical side and my personal desires are in considerable conflict at the moment. What do your personal desires want? He met her eyes, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. They want to spend every possible moment with you. They want to show you San Francisco myself. Watch your face as you see the ocean for the first time. Be there for all your new experiences. But that would be selfish of me. You need space to discover who you are without someone hovering over you. What if I do not want space? What if I want you hovering, Caroline? I know. We are tabling this conversation until I have had time to adjust. But you cannot blame me for trying. He smiled, that beautiful smile that transformed his whole face. I do not blame you for anything. You are remarkable, you know that. You went from near starvation to traveling across 2 states to making plans for an independent future, and you have handled all of it with grace and strength. I am in awe of you. No one had ever said anything like that to Caroline before. Her father had loved her in his distracted way, but he had never really seen her as a person separate from his own ambitions and failures. Her mother had been too busy surviving to have energy left for admiration. Dalton's words settled into her heart like seeds, promising future growth. They reached San Francisco on a gray, foggy morning 3 weeks after leaving Bonanza. The city rose from the hills like something from a dream, buildings packed together in impossible density, streets climbing slopes so steep Caroline could not imagine how anyone navigated them. The harbor was filled with ships, their masts creating a forest of wood and rope that swayed with the tide. It is incredible, Caroline breathed, taking in the scope of it all. Wait until you see it on a clear day when the sun hits the water. It is even better. Dalton guided them through the crowded streets with the ease of someone who knew the city well, pointing out landmarks and notable buildings as they went. Mrs. Flynn's boarding house was located in a respectable neighborhood on Nob Hill, a 3-story Victorian painted cheerful yellow with white trim. The woman herself met them at the door, a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "Dalton York, you are a sight for sore eyes," she said, embracing him warmly. "And this must be Miss Zimmerman. My dear, you look exhausted. Come in, come in. I have a room all ready for you." The boarding house was clean and well appointed, with a comfortable parlor and a dining room that seated a dozen people. Mrs. Flynn showed Caroline to a room on the 2nd floor, bright and airy with a view of the street below. "We keep decent hours here," Mrs. Flynn explained. "Breakfast at 7, dinner at 6. No gentlemen callers above the 1st floor, no alcohol in the rooms, and church on Sundays is strongly encouraged but not required. There are 6 other young ladies in residence at the moment, all good girls making their way in the city. I think you will like them." After Mrs. Flynn left, Caroline stood at the window looking out at San Francisco, trying to process everything that had happened in the past month. She had gone from desperate and trapped to free and financially secure. She had traveled hundreds of miles, learned new skills, discovered strengths she did not know she possessed. And she had fallen in love, though she was not yet allowed to do anything about it. Dalton visited every day that first week, ostensibly to handle legal matters related to her inheritance, but really, Caroline suspected, just to check on her. He introduced her to his colleagues, helped her open accounts at a reputable bank, and walked her through the city pointing out places she might find useful or entertaining. Mrs. Flynn's other residents were welcoming, drawing Caroline into their circle with ease. There was Margaret, who worked as a teacher at a nearby school. Alice, who was training to be a nurse. Sarah, who had ambitions of becoming a journalist despite the obstacles facing women in that profession. They were all around Caroline's age, all navigating the challenges of independence with varying degrees of success, and Caroline found their company refreshing and inspiring. But despite the new friends and new experiences, Caroline found her thoughts constantly returning to Dalton. She looked forward to his visits with an intensity that would have embarrassed her if she had allowed herself to think about it too much. He was unfailingly proper in his behavior, never giving misses. Flynn any reason to question his intentions, but Caroline caught the way he looked at her sometimes, when he thought she was not paying attention. It was a look that gave her hope. 6 weeks after arriving in San Francisco, Caroline was sitting in the boarding house parlor with Alice when Mrs. Flynn announced that Dalton was there to see her. Caroline tried not to jump up too eagerly, but from Alice's knowing smile she had not succeeded. Dalton looked troubled when she joined him, and Caroline's good mood evaporated. "What is wrong? I received a telegram this morning from the sheriff in Silver Creek. Marcus Thornhill has been asking questions about you, about where you went and who you were traveling with. He told people you stole money from him and that he is trying to track you down to recover it." Caroline felt cold fear wash over her. "But that is a lie. He has no claim to my money. I know that, and you know that, but it gives him an excuse to pursue you. He is claiming to be the aggrieved party, which makes him look sympathetic. What do we do?" "I have already sent statements to every major newspaper in Nevada and California detailing the true situation, along with documentation of your inheritance and proof that Thornhill has no legal claim to anything. But Caroline, you need to understand that he is not going to stop. Men like him never do. He sees you as something that was taken from him and he wants revenge. Then we wait for him to come here and we face him. Or," Dalton said carefully, "you could disappear more thoroughly. Take a new name, move to a different city, somewhere he would never think to look." "Run and hide, you mean? Spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder? Stay safe, I mean." Caroline stood and paced to the window, her mind working through the problem. She had spent too long being afraid, too long letting circumstances dictate her choices. The idea of running from Marcus felt like surrendering, like admitting he still had power over her life. "No," she said firmly. "I am done running. If Marcus wants to come to San Francisco and make accusations, let him come. I have the truth on my side, I have legal documentation, and I have you to help me navigate the system. I will not let him chase me away from the life I am trying to build." Dalton crossed to stand beside her at the window. "You are certain? Because once we take this route, there is no going back. We will have to face whatever he brings." "I am certain. Besides," she added with more confidence than she felt, "he is just one angry man making noise. Surely the law will see through his lies." As it turned out, Marcus did more than make noise. He arrived in San Francisco 2 weeks later with a hired lawyer and a manufactured case claiming that Caroline's father had borrowed money from him personally, that Caroline had agreed to marry him in lieu of repayment, and that her sudden departure constituted theft and breach of contract. It was creative and entirely fabricated, but it was enough to force a court hearing. Dalton was furious when he learned about the legal filing. "This is harassment, pure and simple. No legitimate judge will take this seriously." But the judge assigned to the case, a man named Hargrove, turned out to be sympathetic to Marcus's version of events. During the preliminary hearing, he made it clear that he believed a woman's agreement to marry constituted a binding contract, regardless of the circumstances, and that Caroline's flight from Bonanza demonstrated bad faith. "This is ridiculous," Caroline said after the hearing, pacing Dalton's office in agitation. He is lying about everything, and the judge is believing him. Judge Hargrove has a reputation for being unsympathetic to women, particularly women who defy traditional expectations, Dalton said grimly. I should have anticipated this and requested a different judge. What do we do now? We fight. We bring evidence, we bring witnesses. We prove that Marcus is lying and that his case has no merit. It will take time and money, but we will win. The trial stretched over 3 weeks, becoming something of a spectacle in San Francisco legal circles. Dalton brought in records from the mining company proving Caroline's inheritance was legitimate. He brought in witnesses from Bonanza who testified to Marcus's reputation and his history with previous wives. He brought in the Reverend who had been conducting the wedding and who confirmed that Caroline had fainted before the ceremony was completed, making the marriage invalid. Marcus's lawyer countered with witnesses of his own, men who claimed to have seen loan agreements between Marcus and Caroline's father, documents that Caroline and Dalton both knew were forgeries. The trial became a battle of credibility, and Caroline watched with growing anxiety as Judge Hargrove seemed to give equal weight to both sides, despite the clear difference in evidence quality. Through it all, Dalton was her rock, preparing her for testimony, coaching her on how to respond to hostile questions, and never once suggesting that she should have just run like he had first proposed. The other residents of Mrs. Flynn's boarding house rallied around her as well, attending the trial to show support and writing letters to newspapers defending her character. On the final day of testimony, Dalton called Caroline to the stand. She had been dreading this moment, knowing that Marcus's lawyer would try to tear apart her credibility, but Dalton had prepared her well. Miss Zimmerman, Dalton began, his voice formal for the benefit of the court, please tell the court about the circumstances leading up to your planned marriage to Marcus Thornhill. Caroline took a deep breath and told her story. She described her father's death, the debts he left behind, her mother's abandonment. She described the hunger, the desperation, the complete absence of choice. She looked directly at Marcus as she described his proposal, the way it was framed not as a request, but as the only option available to her. Did you want to marry Mr. Thornhill? Dalton asked. No, I was terrified of him. Then why did you agree? Because I thought I had no other choice. I thought it was marriage or starvation, and I chose survival. Marcus's lawyer, a slick man named Patterson, cross-examined her aggressively. He implied that she had been mercenary, that she had known about her inheritance all along, and had led Marcus on to extract favors from him. He suggested that her collapse at the wedding was staged to get out of her obligations. He painted her as a conniving woman who had manipulated good men for her own benefit. Through it all, Caroline remained calm, answering each accusation with simple truth. Yes, she had agreed to the marriage. No, she had not known about the inheritance. Yes, she had left town quickly after learning the truth. No, she did not regret her choices. Is it not true, Miss Zimmerman, that you are now romantically involved with your own lawyer? Patterson asked with a smirk. That this entire elaborate story is just a cover for the fact that you met a wealthier, more attractive man and decided to trade up. Caroline felt her face flush, but before she could answer, Dalton was on his feet. Objection. Counsel is speculating and introducing irrelevant personal matters. I will allow it, Judge Hargrove said. The witness will answer. Caroline looked at Dalton, trying to read his expression, then turned back to the lawyer. Mr. York has been nothing but professional in his dealings with me. He has represented my interests with integrity and skill. Whether or not I have personal feelings for him is irrelevant to the question of whether Mr. Thornhill has any legal claim to my inheritance, which he does not. So you admit You have feelings for him. I admit nothing except that Mr. Thornhill is a liar and a bully who is trying to use the courts to punish me for escaping his control. I may have been poor and desperate in Bonanza, but I am neither of those things now. I have the resources to fight him, and that is exactly what I intend to do." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Judge Hargrove had to bang his gavel several times to restore order. When both sides had finished presenting their cases, the judge announced he would take the matter under advisement and issue a ruling within a week. Those 7 days were the longest of Caroline's life. She barely slept, played out every possible scenario in her mind, and drove poor Alice and the other boarders to distraction with her nervous energy. Dalton tried to reassure her that the evidence was overwhelmingly in her favor, but even he could not predict how Judge Hargrove would rule. On the appointed day, the courtroom was packed with spectators. Caroline sat in the front row with Dalton beside her, gripping her hands together so tightly her knuckles were white. Marcus sat across the aisle with his lawyer, looking smug and confident. Judge Hargrove entered, and everyone stood. He took his seat at the bench, shuffled some papers, and began to read his ruling. The legal language was dense and hard to follow, but gradually Caroline began to understand that the judge was ruling in her favor. He found that Marcus had failed to provide credible evidence of any loan or contract, that the marriage ceremony had been legally invalid due to Caroline's collapse, and that she had every right to leave Bonanza once she learned of her inheritance. Furthermore, Judge Hargrove continued, his voice taking on a stern tone, this court finds that Mr. Thornhill has abused the legal system in an attempt to harass and intimidate Miss Zimmerman. He is hereby ordered to pay all court costs and attorney fees associated with this case, and he is prohibited from making any further legal claims against Miss Zimmerman or contacting her in any way. Should he violate this order, he will be held in contempt. Caroline felt tears streaming down her face before she even realized she was crying. Dalton's hand found hers under the table and squeezed gently. Around them, the courtroom erupted in applause, which the judge did not bother to silence. Marcus's face had gone purple with rage, and he leapt to his feet. "This is not over. That money should be mine. She owes me, Mr. Thornhill," Judge Hargrove said coldly. "You are dangerously close to being held in contempt right now. I suggest you leave this courtroom before I have the bailiff remove you." Marcus stormed out, his lawyer hurrying after him, and Caroline collapsed against Dalton's shoulder, shaking with relief and residual fear and triumphant joy. "It is over," Dalton murmured against her hair. "You are safe. You are free. It is really over." The celebration that night at Mrs. Flynn's boarding house was loud and joyous, with the other residents and several of Dalton's lawyer friends joining in toasting Caroline's victory. But beneath the happiness, Caroline felt a strange melancholy. The trial had given her a purpose, something to focus on and fight against. Now that it was over, she had to figure out what came next. 2 days later, she asked Dalton to take a walk with her along the waterfront. They strolled in comfortable silence for a while, watching ships come and go, seagulls wheeling overhead, the vast Pacific stretching to the horizon. "You have been quiet since the trial ended," Dalton observed. "Is something troubling you?" "Not troubling exactly. Just thinking about what comes next. I have been in San Francisco for 3 months now. I have friends, a comfortable place to live, more money than I know what to do with. I should be happy. But you are not." "I am, just not completely. There is something missing, and I think you know what it is." Dalton stopped walking and turned to face her. "Caroline, you said we should wait until I had time to adjust, until I was sure of my feelings. Well, I have waited and I have adjusted, and I am sure. I have been sure since somewhere in the middle of Nevada when you taught me how to start a fire and told me stories about growing up in Texas. I am in love with you, Dalton York, and I am tired of pretending otherwise." He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, they were bright with emotion. "I have been in love with you since I saw you standing at that altar in your oversized wedding dress, so thin I could count your ribs through the fabric, and so brave I could barely breathe. Every day since then has been a test of my self-control. I wanted to court you properly to give you time to do things right. Then court me, but do it knowing that I already know how the story ends. It ends with us together if you will have me, if I will have you." Dalton laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Caroline, you are the most remarkable woman I have ever met, strong and smart and brave and kind. Having you would be the greatest honor of my life." He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, right there on the public waterfront with dozens of people walking past. It was improper and scandalous and absolutely perfect. Caroline wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, pouring 3 months of repressed feelings into that single moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dalton rested his forehead against hers. "I should do this properly. I should ask permission and get a ring and plan something romantic. Or you could just ask me now, and we could plan the rest together. Caroline Zimmerman, will you marry me? For real this time, with a ceremony that actually finishes and a future we build together." "Yes. Absolutely yes." They married 6 weeks later in the same church, where Caroline had been attending services with Mrs. Flynn and the other boarders. It was a small ceremony with only close friends in attendance, nothing like the grim affair in Bonanza. Caroline wore a new dress that actually fit her, pale blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes, and she carried wildflowers that reminded her of the Nevada landscape, where she and Dalton had fallen in love. This time, when the Reverend asked if anyone objected, there was only warm silence. This time, when Dalton took her hand, it was with joy rather than obligation. And this time, when they said their vows, Caroline meant every word with her whole heart. They honeymooned in a small coastal town south of San Francisco, spending lazy days exploring tide pools and watching whales breach in the distance. At night, they stayed in a little cottage that overlooked the ocean, and Dalton held her close and told her all the things he had been holding back for months, how beautiful he found her, how much he admired her strength, how grateful he was that circumstances had brought them together. When they returned to San Francisco, they moved into a house Dalton had purchased on Telegraph Hill, a modest Victorian with enough room to grow into. Caroline continued her friendship with the women from Mrs. Flynn's boarding house, hosting weekly dinners where they discussed everything from politics to literature to their hopes for the future. Dalton gradually shifted his law practice to take on more cases involving women's rights and property law, using his skills to help others who found themselves in situations similar to Caroline's. She sometimes assisted with research and client interviews, discovering she had a knack for the legal work. A year into their marriage, Caroline discovered she was pregnant. The news was both thrilling and terrifying, bringing up old fears about dependence and loss of autonomy. But Dalton was patient with her concerns, talking through each fear and reassuring her that their partnership would not change just because they were becoming parents. Their son was born in the spring of 1876, a healthy baby boy they named Henry Thomas York. He had Dalton's eyes and Caroline's stubborn chin, and he quickly became the center of their world. Dalton was a devoted father, participating in Henry's care in ways that made other men in their social circle uncomfortable, but that Caroline found incredibly attractive. 2 years later, a daughter followed, whom they named Ruth Caroline. She was quieter than her brother, more observant, watching the world with serious eyes before deciding how to engage with it. Caroline saw echoes of herself in Ruth's careful approach to new situations. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Dalton's practice thrived, and Caroline became more involved in the legal work, eventually studying law herself under Dalton's tutelage. California did not allow women to practice law officially, but she could assist and research, and she found the work intellectually satisfying. They heard news from Nevada occasionally. Marcus Thornhill had eventually left Bonanza after his reputation was ruined by the trial. Some said he went to Arizona, others claimed he died in a bar fight in Reno. Caroline found she did not particularly care what had happened to him. He was part of her past, a nightmare she had survived, and she refused to give him any more power over her present. Margaret from the boarding house married a journalist and moved to New York. Alice became the head nurse at a San Francisco hospital. Sarah achieved her dream of becoming a journalist, writing fiery editorials about labor rights and women's suffrage. They all remained close, their children growing up together, their lives intertwined in the way that happens when people bond through shared struggles and dreams. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Dalton surprised Caroline with a trip back to Nevada. Not to Bonanza, which neither of them had any desire to see again, but to the stretch of desert where they had camped during their journey west. "Why here?" Caroline asked as they sat by a fire much like the ones from that trip, their children safely in San Francisco with Mrs. Flynn, who had become an honorary grandmother. "Because this is where I first realized I was in love with you," Dalton said. "We were sitting just like this, talking about freedom and choices and what kind of life you wanted to build. And I looked at you in the firelight and thought, I want to spend the rest of my life having conversations with this woman. Everything since then has just been details." Caroline leaned against his shoulder, watching the flames dance. "I was so scared during that trip. Scared of the future, scared of my feelings for you, scared I would wake up and find it was all a dream. And now I am just grateful. Grateful that you came to Bonanza when you did. Grateful that you fed me and married me anyway when I fainted at that altar. Grateful for every day we have built together." "I was the one who got lucky," Dalton countered. "You could have chosen to leave San Francisco to travel the world to do anything you wanted with your freedom. Instead, you chose to stay with me. It was not instead of freedom. It was choosing you as part of my freedom. That is what you never quite understood, Dalton. You did not trap me or limit me. You gave me a foundation strong enough that I could safely explore who I wanted to be." They stayed at the campsite for 3 days, recreating their journey in miniature, remembering who they had been and celebrating who they had become. Then they returned to San Francisco, to their children and their work and their community, to the life they had built together through trust and patience and love. 10 years after that desperate day in Bonanza, Caroline stood in the doorway of their home watching Dalton play in the yard with Henry and Ruth, now joined by their youngest daughter, Grace, who had arrived unexpectedly 5 years into their marriage. The house was full of noise and love and the comfortable chaos of a growing family. She thought about the girl she had been, standing at an altar in an ill-fitting dress, so hungry she could barely stand. That girl had been brave out of necessity, surviving because there was no other choice. But she had also been the seed of the woman Caroline had become, someone who chose courage even when survival was no longer at stake. Sometimes, late at night, she would dream about that moment in the church when Dalton had burst through the doors. In her dreams, she saw all the possible futures spinning out from that single instant. The future where he did not arrive in time, where she married Marcus and suffered whatever fate awaited her there. The future where she took her inheritance and disappeared alone into the world. All the paths not taken, all the lives she could have lived. But when she woke, it was always to this life, this reality, this choice she had made to love and be loved by Dalton York. And every single time, she felt grateful beyond measure that of all the possible stories her life could have told, she got to live this one. On their 20th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their grown children and their friends and a community they had helped build, Caroline gave a toast. 20 years ago, I fainted at an altar because I had not eaten in 3 days. A cowboy fed me and married me anyway. Everyone said it was a rescue story, that Dalton saved me from a terrible fate. But what they did not understand then, and what I want everyone to understand now, is that we saved each other. He gave me food and protection when I was at my weakest. I gave him purpose and partnership when he was questioning his path. Together, we built something neither of us could have built alone. That is not a rescue, that is love, and I am grateful for it every single day. Dalton stood and pulled her close, kissing her in front of everyone the same way he had on that San Francisco waterfront so many years ago. Their children groaned in mock embarrassment. Their friends cheered and Caroline laughed against his lips, thinking that this, exactly this, was what happiness felt like. They grew old together in San Francisco, watching the city change and grow around them, watching their children become adults with families of their own. They faced hardships together, weathering economic downturns and health scares and the inevitable losses that come with a long life. But through it all, they had each other, and that foundation proved strong enough to withstand everything the world threw at them. When Dalton died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Caroline grieved deeply, but without regret. They had 53 years together, 5 decades of love and partnership and shared dreams. He had lived long enough to meet his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, long enough to see Caroline become a legal advisor to dozens of women fighting for their rights, long enough to retire from his practice and spend lazy mornings in their garden discussing everything and nothing. She lived 4 more years after his passing, spending them writing down their story for her grandchildren, wanting them to understand where they came from and what was possible when you chose love over fear. She told them about bonanza and hunger and wedding dresses that did not fit. She told them about trail rides and campfires and slowly falling in love. She told them about building a life from scratch, about choosing each other every day, about the kind of partnership that made both people stronger. When Caroline died at 82, peacefully and surrounded by family, her last conscious thought was of Dalton, young and dusty and standing in the doorway of that church in Bonanza, and how her whole life had changed in that single moment when a cowboy decided to care about the fate of one hungry girl. They buried her next to Dalton under an oak tree in a San Francisco cemetery, their gravestones simple but together, the way they had lived their lives. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to remember them, telling stories that would become family legend, about how a love story began at a wedding that never finished and lasted for the rest of 2 long and well-lived lives. The story of Caroline Zimmerman and Dalton York became something of a legend in their family, passed down through generations. How she had stood at an altar starving and desperate, how he had appeared at exactly the right moment, how they had chosen each other against all logic and built something beautiful from nothing. It was a reminder that sometimes rescue comes from unexpected places, that love can bloom even in the harshest circumstances, and that the best stories are the ones where 2 people save each other. Years after their deaths, their great-great-granddaughter stood at her own wedding in San Francisco, wearing the pearl necklace that had belonged to Caroline, carrying wildflowers like the ones Caroline had carried at her wedding to Dalton. The Reverend talked about the holy bonds of matrimony, about commitment and partnership, and building a life together. And somewhere, in whatever place exists beyond this life, Caroline and Dalton smiled, knowing their legacy was not just the family they created, but the example they set, showing everyone who came after that real love is not about rescue or obligation, but about two people choosing every day to face the world together. The end.